Welcome to the 109th episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're excited to be back to give our thoughts on UTSA fall football camp. Let's get started.
Before we skip too far ahead, A. Toves, let's set the table of the type of season we were coming off of. You know, we had plenty of moments last season when we talked about how undisciplined the team looked.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about how there was a lack of execution at times. In the spring, we saw more of a transition. You know, Coach Traylor came out, discussed some of the thoughts he had on, you know, after he had a little bit of self-reflection on the team and where it had been at during the fall of 2024. Throughout the summer, we've been wondering, you know, are those changes really going to be made? You know,
Right.
or is it just coach speak, right? Then we start coming into fall camp. We hear the Devin McEwen interview. And while Cam Cooper had a good interview, Devin McEwen's to me was a little more eye-opening. The reason being because he mentioned a few things that start building more of a story of what happened in 2024. You know, he mentioned some position groups being disciplined for guys being late to meetings, the coaching staff really trying to hone in on this discipline of the team. I interpret it as a team being kind of lax on getting to meetings on time, and you know, in the previous season, because that's what Devin had mentioned. But he also mentioned the strength staff was kind of paying closer attention to their numbers that they were lifting. And to me, that begins to tell a story of maybe the root cause of some of these injuries that we have seen from, you know, various positions over the, you know, really all of Coach Traylor's tenure. HO's then came the Willie McCoy interview, and, you know, he brought something else up, and it'll lead me to a question here, but he brought up the fact that there was a lot of guys out there looking for their own stats, and they didn't seem to be focused as a unit. HO's, it's safe to say that last season's team wasn't never going to succeed like many of us thought, because it looks like they had obviously a lack of attention to detail. They had a lack of discipline, and the team cohesion was not there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there were probably a lot of little things that kind of contributed to this sort of snowball effect last season. I doubt you can really go back and look at like one specific thing.
Right.
And as you hear these interviews, that's kind of the story it tells you. Like, we probably got a little bit lax on start times for practice, a little bit lax on start times for meetings. Those things in a vacuum wouldn't necessarily lead to what we saw in the field, but then you take that in conjunction with, you know, maybe the strength staff not paying enough attention to somebody lifting too much or trying to do too many reps and then getting injured. And then you add in, again, people being more concerned with their own personal stats versus trying to do the right thing for the team. And you can kind of start to see where maybe these things, plus probably lots of other little things, contributed to, you know, the team just not being buttoned up, not having the discipline, and really not elevating each other like we had seen in previous seasons.
And it's never, like you said, the like one big thing that happens. It's always the little things, and you know, it can be in anything, in any sort of relationship you have. It's the little things that's what gets you there. So here we go on then to some of the offseason changes that Coach Traylor made, and I'd like for you to take us through some of these.
Yeah, I mean, he's talked a lot about, you know, punishment, which is not something that we've really heard him use in the past. And he's even said, look, punishment's not necessarily a word that I've ascribed to, but he really is trying to set a different level of expectations in terms of discipline. And I think he felt like he had to go to some punishment to get to that point, or to make sure that people really were taking him and the coaching staff seriously. He's mentioned several times this new phrase, rules without relationships equal rebellion, which again, it tells us that he's trying to establish rules, but then also to establish the relationships that we know that he's been so good at establishing and that have made the difference, so that people understand why we're doing these things. And it's not just all of a sudden, you know, Coach Traylor cracking down on things that he's never done before. But then, there's been some other interesting things that he's talked about, like pushing the practice time back an hour just to make it hotter when they're out there, to make the environment more challenging, more grueling, so that when they get out on the field and they're playing at Texas A&M in the heat of the day, they're more prepared, and perhaps you'll see them feeling like, okay, this is an environment we're used to. There's a lot of talk about, hey, you play in the Alamo Dome and it's great because it's always 72 degrees, but then what happens when you go to San Marcos in the middle of the day, or you're playing at Texas A&M and it's the heat of the day? So I think some of those things will hopefully make a difference. But then he's also talked a lot about team building and team cohesion. And one of the interesting things that they spoke about recently in some of the post-practice and media day interviews were these 4-H, where the players are talking about their history, their heroes, their highlights, their hardships. Apparently it's something that they've done previously with the freshmen kind of coming in, but I think Coach Traylor realized that with all of the new transfers that have come into this team and new starters and new leaders, that he really needed to make sure that these guys were looking out for the team, understanding each other a little bit better, kind of going back to what Willie McCoy said before, where, if people are out there stat chasing, that's not really going to create a good environment for the team. So I think he was trying to find a way to bring them together.
One other key thing that we heard from Cam Cooper was there was more walkthroughs this camp versus previous camps. Mm-hmm. Attention to detail. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? He talked a lot about how he worked on his own, but the fact that the team is also working on this tells you again, Coach Traylor realized we got away from some things, and in order for us to be able to compete with Army, you have to be disciplined. Mm-hmm. And I think I've always talked about the fact that this UTSA team has never been close to being disciplined enough to defeat this Army team, because there's just a difference, right? But I think helped him see that, look, if you're the triangle of toughness, you've got to be you've got to be able to do some of these things, work in the heat, do some of these other, right? But Atos, I think these team building exercises or activities are a great start to at least start figuring out what is the next level they have to get to mm-hmm. continue to build as a team. And we hear that a lot from plenty of our other UTSA teams. We've heard, just Coach Derek Pittman talk about it last week with us in terms of bringing in the special ops team from the Navy. We've seen plenty of other of the teams get together and do things together, go out to schools, go out, it's those things that may seem minor that, again, it's the little things. All of a sudden you get to know each other on these car trips. All of a sudden you get to see that.
Yeah, and I think, more and more as we start to see the transfer portal impact these programs, whether it's football, basketball, different schools, you're going to have a different level of churn every season. You're going to have to focus every season on team building and team cohesion more than you have in the past, because the days where we talked about, Coach Traylor being so fortunate that we had the super seniors and these really veteran guys that were hanging around for an extra season are probably not as realistic. I mean, even the guys who got that JUCO season this year, not all of them stayed. We had Willie McCoy stay and Robert Henry stay, but we still lost Martavius French and Jamori Robinson. So, you've got to really understand how you can build that sort of team environment at a much, much quicker pace. And I think the teams and the coaches that are successful at doing that are going to have an advantage as we move forward in this environment.
Great point. And I think that was something that you always wondered aloud about men's basketball. And it wasn't just the UTSA men's basketball team. It was just really just men's basketball in general, because there was just so much movement from players, from team to team. And you've discussed even with some of our family members, you've got these players that come in as a freshman at school A, and then they go to school B, and they go to school C. they're learning a different culture, quote unquote, every single year of their college career. So it does become difficult, and not something that we probably have ever thought of, maybe how Coach Traylor and his football team would have to deal with that.
Yeah. I mean, we really have had a luxury with our super seniors that a lot of teams haven't had. And, it's just the nature of the fact that most of those players with extra COVID seasons have played out their eligibility now. And so you just have to adjust.
Very true. So let's get over to the scrimmage, because we did get a chance to go out this past Saturday and see this year's UTSA Roadrunner team and kind of get a better glimpse, at least, of a practice and figure out, okay, are things going and trending in the right direction, or are there just bigger issues that we've seen? So it was, I think two questions were really just, would we see anything different from last season? And are these offseason changes that we've already kind of begun outlining and have set the table with, or were they going to work?
Yeah. And I think the first thing we noticed coming into this practice was that the tone really felt very different. Coming in as an outsider, we have seen scrimmages in the spring, we've seen scrimmages in previous years, and there's generally a much more like lighthearted kind of environment where you see people on the sidelines and they're kind of chit-chatting with each other. They might be talking to their parents or other people who have come to watch practice. There's a lot of dancing on the sidelines because they usually have music playing in the background. And this practice was a very different feeling. When you walked in, it felt very focused, very businesslike. You didn't see the kind of chit-chatting, goofing around on the sidelines. The team was watching what was happening on the field. They were, waiting for their number to get, called. It was just a very different environment. It felt much more game-like than we've seen.
And I'll add the fact that on the sideline, we were also able to hear at times the interactions between players and coaches. And what I saw most of this past Saturday was players coming to the sideline, talking with their coaches, and getting more instruction. Mm-hmm. It felt much more educational. This program seemed to have kind of gotten a little lax, a little complacent, and kind of felt like they would step on the field, and because it says UTSA on their jersey or Roadrunners, that other teams are just going to lay down for them because we've been that good. That's not the case. And I think this team is turning into a team that realizes that margin of error is much smaller, and that the errors that they made last season because they were undisciplined, because they were sloppy in execution, that's what was costing them games, especially on the road. Again, we've heard these type of little blips from Coach Aston, from Coach Pittman. We've heard it too from Coach Clonch. Every single UTSA coach has been talking about it. And again, I think it's been a luxury for Jeff Traylor that he hasn't had to really bring that out so much, because I think his team has been able to, meet that moment for the most part. Mm-hmm. So, look, things kind of went awry, but now the scrimmage is coming in. Things have changed. And look, let's also not paint that picture that they weren't having fun. They were having fun. It was just it was more serious than it had been before. A more serious fun, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
The other thing was that you didn't see quite as many players on the sideline that were injured.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely nice. I mean, the amount of scooters, air cast, and crutches that we would have seen if this was last season were, none of that was on the sideline this season.
Yeah, we mostly probably would have been able to count the scooters on one hand, and
right.
then you just keep adding to it. And to me, I still think that has a lot to do with the strength staff and just how much more the coaching staff paid attention to their players and how they're working out and what they're doing. Maybe got a much more structured approach. We haven't really heard Coach Traylor talk too much about it, but
Well, other than talking about how they started,
Right, right.
you know, at a different timeline because they were spending time on, like, especially in the spring, they focused a lot on strength and conditioning before they jumped into the spring practice. And then again, I think they really put more of a focus on a deliberate plan this season.
I agree because we've heard him talk about before. Oh, I wanted strength staff to have more time with my guys, but it always kind of still felt like you still have some of the same problems. So I think attention to those numbers really has. We have less scooters, and let's be honest, we want to see less scooters out there, less crutches and air casts, because that means, I mean, there's going to be freak injuries. Let's not paint over that.
Sure.
But there are certain muscular injuries that you were seeing over the last couple seasons, and it's not just UTSA. It is throughout sports that does have to concern you. That you do need to give these athletes much more structure when they're going through strength training. So overall thoughts, I think coming in from the spring, we're just a little concerned about the cornerback depth. Not the cornerback, I think, quality. I think it's just the depth of
Right.
how many bodies we actually have. And then we also had a concern, obviously, our annual concern of the offensive line that, has always been banged up, and we've already talked about the fact that, we saw less scooters. So good to see that actually no offensive lineman on a scooter, which is good because lower leg injuries for the bigger guys can just be terrible ways to go through your career. So, Atos, when I say that, based on what you saw in the scrimmage for the cornerbacks and the offensive line, do you feel like there was any change there, or do you think that things are looking a little bit better?
Well, I think on the offensive line for sure, it looks a lot better. Again, it seemed like everyone was healthy, and we did see some rotation, but not as much rotation as we've seen in the past. Feels like they've solidified that Ben Rios is likely going to be the center. So, you feel like things just feel like we've wanted them to feel in the past, where, we're going in, everyone appears to be healthy. They appear to have depth. There are some guys that, we saw rotate in from time to time with the ones that probably could get on the field, if they decide not to just stick with that core five. And that's just a luxury that we've always wanted to have, but just never has been a reality. So cautiously optimistic that it's going to stay that way. Of course, we got to get through that first A&M game, because that always feels like there's one guy in the very first game that goes out on the O-line. So
Sure.
don't want to jinx him.
Yeah, I would say just light the candles for the health of the cornerbacks and the offensive line, because if the offensive line fails, you start seeing then issues for Owen McCown, and if Owen goes down, I think we're talking about a different trajectory to the season. I would talk about a little bit more about the backup quarterback, but I think we got to be careful here because obviously the backup quarterback is probably going to be usually the most popular player on the team, because they represent the change from what the starter can't do. But I feel like the biggest red flag, I would say, with the backup quarterback is that, to me, it's a steeper drop off than I think I've seen in Traylor's tenure, from starting quarterback to the QB2.
Yeah, I mean, he's usually had one, in some cases, two guys, that were in that quarterback room that you could have made an argument could or should start, and that's where kind of your comment about being the most popular person, if you, once Frank Harris did something wrong, it was like, I told you we should be with Josh Adkins or Lowell Narcisse or, ABC, whoever it was. But we just don't have that luxury of depth this year.
Yeah, and that's not to say that I don't think that they could find a way to maybe coach up some of these guys if something went wrong with Owen. It'll be interesting to see, I think, how he handles the off season. And I mean, by that, I mean Coach Traylor, because if you look at QB2, QB3 right now, does it make you feel like one of those guys is the heir apparent to to Owen McCown?
No, I mean, and that's where, I'm very concerned about the offensive line, even though I've made these comments about, hey, it looks like we have depth. It looks like everyone's healthy. You just always have in the back of your mind, hey, we got to keep Owen healthy and upright, because I don't feel like we have that, heir apparent right now in the room. Max Gerlich, is probably QB 3.5 at this point. Probably right there with Lugo. I mean, I think it's fair to say Brandon Tennyson's probably your number 2.
Yeah.
And then Lugo and Gerlich are, fighting for number 3. But Gerlich's just a true freshman, and the game looks like it's still kind of fast for him. So I could see perhaps him developing down the road, but I'm not sure 100% that he'll be, the heir apparent to Owen. Lugo and Tennyson, I just haven't seen anything from either one of them that makes me think like, if Owen hit the transfer portal next year, that's the guy.
I mean, one of the things I saw from Lugo and Tennyson on Saturday was the fact that there was a lot of anticipatory throws behind a lot of receivers.
Mm-hmm.
There was at least one of Brandon Tennyson's interceptions was well behind the running back coming out of the backfield, and it got tipped into a linebacker, I think, or safety's hands. And those are the things that concern you, right? Like,
yeah.
you didn't see that from previous backup quarterbacks where it was like it was behind him. And then he did throw a touchdown pass later on, but it had to be against I would say deep down the defensive rotation, because it was still behind Jamel Hardy. Jamel Hardy did a good job of coming back to make the play and make the catch, but it still just wasn't in front of Jamel Hardy so that he could run through the ball and run through the end zone. It was more of, if they didn't condense the field, that would have been first down at about the 3-yard line instead of touchdown where it should have been, because Jamel had burned the corner. So, it's those little things that kind of just, it keeps you up at night, I guess is the best way to put it. But
yeah, I mean, the good news, I think, is that Traylor has spoken highly of Tennyson. He said he looks more like the kid that he recruited. So perhaps he's going to be the one that Traylor refers to as potential this season. But the thing that's always going to hurt Tennyson is just his height.
Yeah. And I think the other part too is he could have had a bad day, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
We could have seen him on the bad day. We were not out there every single day. So from what we saw, though, that was one of the concerns. I think the wide receivers look pretty good. The wide receivers and tight ends look good. I don't think there's really any argument there. Going back to maybe the bright spots of what we saw at Ato's, you talked about the overall tone. I think there was also a crispness to this team where, you kind of talked about the fact that everybody was paying attention. The only times really that the snap was stopped was because the coaches wanted to see somebody different in. It wasn't because the players were late getting on the field, which has happened a few times in previous scrimmages.
Mm-hmm.
It did not happen. And then it took until the third stringers came on for the first flag to appear.
Right.
This has been kind of talked about too, is the fact that there's been more referees out there. So clearly they are focusing on the fact that there was just way too many penalties last year.
Yeah. Pre-snap penalties, I think, were probably one of Jeff Traylor's, biggest frustrations for the season. So, and we saw that during previous scrimmages where you would have pre-snap penalties, and here
Right.
you are, you're on a practice field. There's no crowd noise. I mean, yeah, they got some music kind of playing in the background, but it's not the dome. You're on the practice field. So it was good that those types of things had been cleaned up.
Yeah. I mean, really, it's about as quiet as it could be out there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was always disconcerting to me. And I had brought that up, but it looks like they've worked through some of that, and a lot of that comes with cohesion, right? Like even though they're switching offensive linemen around, it's clear that they've been working together much more because of the fact that they're healthy. So, that was good. I think it was crucial though for this defensive team to be a little crisper, coming on and off the field. As a young team, they need that time because they know that they're going to play some fast offenses. So that means that they're going to have to be paying attention in order to get back on the field. So it was something like that, again, it's a small thing, and a small thing I noticed, but it was much bigger because that's just not how it had looked like in previous years. So to me, I think it begins to answer some of these questions of some of these off-season changes they made clearly are making an effect on the product on the field. Obviously, we won't know if that ever really fixes everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we'll get to the regular season. We'll see, do they look better? To me, I think they will. I think their approach and the way that they handled themselves out there on Saturday leads me to believe that we're going to be much crisper in terms of execution. We're going to be having much more cohesion as a team, and I think the communication is going to improve. And I think that was another thing that I heard was a lot of communication. It wasn't like trash talking or anything like that. It was more of offense talking to each other, defense talking to each other. It was encouraging to see them. And I think a lot of that has to do, again, with everything that Coach Traylor has been putting in place here. Hey, Tubbs, anything else that has caught your eye?
I think we about covered everything. I mean, I think it just really goes back to we still have several unknowns. We've got a lot of talented kids that we brought in on the defense, but a lot of them haven't played snaps at UTSA. The ones that are returning aren't returning starters per se. They're people that had playing time. So, all of these things that we've talked about, I think are going to be helpful, but you still just have kind of a question mark about what is that really going to look like when we get to game time?
Yeah. So let's then move on to the single digits because they did come out. And I mean, I feel like when I looked at them, at least offensively, you pretty much know those guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you had the question of, we're not really going to know who's going to be on defense, right? Because it's going to be a new defense.
Yeah, I mean, the only returning single digit we had on defense was Owen Pee-wee.
Yeah. And to look at the names that were there, obviously I think it stands out to you when you see who gets the 0, and that's Shad Banks.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to have someone who is a transfer, who has never played a snap for UTSA, come into that coveted 0 position. But when you take into consideration the fact that there are so many new guys on the field, it makes a little bit more sense than if this had been last season and, you were talking about somebody who'd never played for UTSA. But still, that is supposed to be the coveted position. And so it is interesting to see that somebody has come in as a transfer and has gained the respect of the team to that level.
Would you say that it would surprise you that it was going to happen this season, or did you think that it might happen maybe in seasons to come? Because we talked about the churn of players, and you kind of almost thought that Owen Pee-wee would elevate there, right? But that's just us as outsiders from what we don't see there inside that locker room.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Owen Pee-wee is a 2, and he's in that 2-0 doesn't surprise me. Honestly, when we were talking about the defensive players, it was just kind of anyone's guess, right? I said, I felt like 0 was Owen Pee-wee's to lose. He's still a 2, so it's not like, he's that far off, but I just really didn't know what to expect when it came to the defense.
Sure. Offensively, I mean, you look at it, would you be surprised that I told you that Owen McCown was not the coveted 0?
I'm actually very shocked that
Really?
Owen is not the 0. Because there's been so much discussion about this is Owen's team. That's been one of the themes that has come out of all of these interviews. This is Owen's team this year. He's the guy. They've asked about him on offense and defense in the interviews, and defense has said that this is Owen's team. So I wonder if Owen chose to stay in a 2 or if he really didn't get voted into the 0. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Houston Thomas, but just given everything that we've heard about Owen, it was just interesting not to see him in that 0.
For me, I'm going to say that I think he chose to stay there, and I'm going to choose to believe that unless I hear differently. And the reason is because, we've talked about what the scrimmage was like. We've talked about how the players have kind of refocused and kind of come together. And we've heard, like you said, stories of how Owen has brought the team together, how Owen has done this, has done that. I think the team looks a lot more like Owen McCown,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like you saw from, the Frank Harris years, right? Frank Harris, a little gregarious, but having fun. But when it came to getting on the field, he always made sure his guys were ready. And it was just a different feel to that UTSA football team. I think now you see it in Owen McCown's shadow, I guess, or persona. And I'm interested just to see. Honestly, I want the season to start right away because I feel like I want to see what this UTSA team is going to be about. We're obviously going to have some sort of predictions later, a couple weeks from now, but I got to tell you, I mean, I want the season to start now because I want to see these guys in action. Like it feels like what I saw on Saturday, how I've seen them handle things. I've got the itch, and I need some UTSA runner football.
Yeah. The two other things on the single digits real quick. It did surprise me that Venley didn't get voted into a single digit. While it's not as noticeable because the offensive linemen don't wear the single digits, he was the only person, I believe, that was voted as a single digit last season that didn't get it this year. So I wonder if maybe part of that just had to do with his injury last season and maybe not feeling like he could take that leadership role as he was kind of fighting to get back into the rotation. And then the other thing I thought was interesting was they didn't fill all of the single digit numbers. If you look at all of the numbers, there's not a 6. There's not a 6 on offense. There's not a 6 on defense. It's kind of interesting, and I wonder if that goes back to some comments that Traylor had made about not taking a hugely different approach to single digits this year, but, he wanted to make sure that the guys that ended up in the single digits this year really deserved to be there and they weren't just who people thought they should be. So, I wonder if he just looked at it and said, look, we've got so many new guys, particularly on defense. We're not going to fill a single digit just to fill a single digit. It really has to be somebody who deserves to be recognized as a leader.
And to Jeff Traylor's credit again, evolution. And you have to evolve. Like, that's the only way that you continue to progress. And look, we saw this team kind of, as we started talking about this, kind of plateau, kind of get complacent, didn't meet the expectations that we had last season. So I think just to wrap this up, it's I think really starting to look like an exciting team. I don't know that it's going to be a playoff team. I don't know that it's going to be a conference championship team, but I think that from what they've done to this point, they're going to put themselves in position to win plenty of games this fall.
Before we go, let's talk a little bit about the UTSA soccer team. We had an opportunity to talk to Coach Pittman last week, but we didn't really get a chance to break down the exhibition match against A&M Corpus Christi. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you saw there?
Sure. Did discuss that they didn't wear jerseys in the interview. So if you haven't heard the interview, just want to make sure I bring that up first because I can only highlight the players that I recognize or that the crowd identified as we were watching. So, the defense was cohesive as usual for Pittman's squad. Even with some newcomers, they didn't look like they were inexperienced out there. And I thought that was a good sign, obviously, this early in the season. But again, you expect that from a Coach Pittman squad. I thought the ball handling and distribution were at a higher level than we've seen in previous seasons. The finishing was also much cleaner, but the first two, ball handling and distribution, the setups and the way that they played off each other throughout the field, it seemed very clean, seemed very organized, and it seemed natural. And it's not what a previous UTSA squad had looked like. And the reason I bring that up is during the interview, I mentioned some things about the midfield players and especially the new ones that have come in. And Coach Pittman said, we were kind of bulldog-ish. And there was a lot of let's kick the ball down the field and let's step back up so we, on defense or on offense, try to chase down the ball. So it was totally, I guess, justified in some ways. That maybe they didn't have the talent or the quality to be able to match up with some of our opponents. But, it just feels like we have the opportunity this season to really build this squad, and I think that Coach Pittman's done a really good job of that. In particular, when I was talking about the finishing, Brooklyn Bailey obviously just kind of jumps out because she scored 3 goals.
Right.
But she brought this presence that we haven't seen from our UTSA forwards, and something that I was hoping that we would see more from them. I mean, the way she megged the goalie on one of her goals, it just looked easy. I mean, you would think, especially in soccer, that being able to kick the ball between somebody's legs should be a given. But the way she smoothly did it, and the class that she did it at, it's rare. And so, it's easy for me to say that, when I played, that I could have done something like that. I don't know that I could have. So it certainly took quite a bit of skill to do that.
Yeah, and you don't really expect to see a true freshman, right out of the gate, have such a great game in their first exhibition. Generally you see them, kind of trying to figure things out, and, either the speed of the game is a little bit different, or, they're just kind of feeling themselves in that first game and trying to get used to it. And so to see her come out with such confidence and to play so well, I mean, I think that really gives us confidence for what we're going to see in the rest of the season.
The moment didn't seem too big for her, even though it was a scrimmage, right? Like, you could write it off however you want. Like, well, it's scrimmage. It's, a lower opponent to a certain extent. I still think that either way, you still have to go up and show up out there. And if you're able to do this now, it's only going to build her like you said, she was confident. It's just going to continue building that confidence to her. When you take on some bigger opponents, she's still able to meet that level. I also like what I saw from Ava Jackson. She's been a face that has been on the sidelines for UTSA the last couple seasons, but because she's been rehabbing from an injury, it just seems like she's just hasn't been able to get back on the pitch, and now she's been able to, and because of it, I think we're going to see at least some more depth in that forward position. And she looked good in the way she moved out there, and I certainly think that there was other forwards that had some sort of quality out there, but for the most part, those were the two that really popped for me.
Right.
Right now, though, I would say if we're looking at what the biggest need is for this team, it's going to be that better execution on set pieces.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I know when we were in Conference USA, that was something that, we talked a lot about the team being really good at executing those. So it's kind of interesting to see now that we've made that jump into the American Conference that you're identifying that as an opportunity.
Sure. And when you look back at what we said in the football section, we talked about the margin of error, being smaller. Well, the margin of error on these set pieces is a lot smaller, and I think the team is recognizing what it takes for them to be able to execute. Now, that's not to say that they're really bad at it. No, they've got some good moments, but it's just not. It's almost like in baseball or even in basketball, I would say. You've hit like 3 out of 5 shots. So you're like, you're feeling pretty good. But then, maybe you play a tougher opponent and you're 3 for 10. Like it's that type of disparity. So I think they'll continue to kind of shore it up. And again, it just depends on who's distributing their, making the kicks from there on the free kicks or corner kicks, whatever it may be. I will say the biggest positive, though, is the midfield. I already kind of alluded to it in terms of ball handling and distribution. The midfielders certainly got a boost in talent, and this was an area where I thought UTSA really needed to improve in order to continue competing in this conference. I've already kind of mentioned before, there was this bulldog mentality, especially with the midfielders, where it was like there really wasn't that connection, connecting the defense and the off and our forwards. So it always kind of felt like that was part of the root cause as to why we struggled at times to score goals, in my opinion. Now you see these midfielders and they seem much more confident on the ball, especially their body control is just different. There's just this way about some of these midfielders that they look like the type of players that we would see from South Florida or a Memphis, who are normally at the top of the conference. So to finally kind of be able to start seeing that talent coming in tells you just how much Derek Pittman has invested in trying to bring in some attacking players, trying to find either some diamonds in the rough or finding those players that he knows will fit with his culture and are going to improve UTSA in this area. 2 names that I've mentioned quite a bit, I think, have been Emily Ekman, who came internationally from Sweden, and Leah Varela, who's a transfer. Both of them didn't look like the moment was too big for them. They looked very smooth, and just handled the ball really well. And so I think it made it easier for BB to have a chance to finish because of the way that she was being set up. Just in very nice ways. I would say Maria Reyes also had some nice moments. I didn't realize who she was until later in the match, but certainly she had moments that I thought really popped to me as well. So again, it's just that infusion of talent in the midfield. But then you also look at a veteran like Michelle Polo and Bree Kerrigan. Bree, so Bree she gets a yellow card during the game, but you don't want to back off. And I mean, one of the things we've talked about in other sports has been how do the veterans get challenged by newcomers, and certainly you see that these newcomers are challenging the veterans, and so they're stepping up, which is certainly good to see. I thought Michelle Polo looked like she had improved in her ball handling, and certainly her shots I thought were much more on target. That said, I think that also has to do with the fact that the distribution to her when she's looking to take a shot on goal was better, so it made it easier for her to get off a really good shot. And that goal she had in the very lower left corner of the goal, really nice. I'm sure you can see the highlights if you go to UTSA Soccer on Instagram or any of the other social media pages, but I got to tell you, it was probably one of her best goals I've seen during her career, and hopefully she's got more in this season. So looking forward to just watching this team.
Yeah, well, our home opener is on Thursday against Houston at Park West at 7 p.m. And then Sunday, we face number 9 TCU at Park West at 7:30. Definitely two very tough teams that we're going to be facing, and a big challenge for both of the teams. So what are some of the things that we should look for or expect in these games?
Look, I'm not so much of a sicko that I've gone down the rabbit hole in college soccer and been able to scout both of these teams. Maybe in the future, when we look at some of the, American Conference teams, I can give a better synopsis of what they might be about. But especially against these teams, I think it's better to look at what we want to take away from UTSA's point of view. It's similar to what we do with when we talk about like the football team going up against, an A&M or a Texas or even a Tennessee in the past few years. Obviously, we want to get out of this like injury free, right? That's clearly one of the things. But especially for this young UTSA team, you really want to see if they're able to keep that higher level of ball handling versus both of these teams. Can they continue to be on the ball the way they were against A&M Corpus Christi? We didn't get to see them play against Texas, but it seemed like they were going toe-to-toe with Texas. So and Texas is ranked. So certainly gives you confidence that once they get here into regular season that they're going to continue that. But I just want to see from my own set of eyes what that looks like and to give any listeners a better idea of where this team is at. The other thing is obviously finishing. We've talked about Brooklyn Bailey and, how she finished, in goal there against A&M Corpus Christi. I want to see, and not just from her, but from all the forwards, if they get the opportunity, can they get the goal? That's been probably the most frustrating thing from either a UTSA fan or even Derek Pittman over the last few seasons, where he's been trying to find someone that can just get that goal and get the score. And, I think he's brought in the talent. So let's see how they go up against these two teams. Obviously, like I said, TCU is going to be a tough game. Just because, like you said, it's number 9, and so they're nothing to sniff at. We saw them a couple seasons ago the NCAA tournament. I didn't feel like UTSA was completely outclassed in that match, but you could tell just the level that TCU is at, and they've just continued building. So that one's going to get interesting.
Yeah, and the Houston game actually is going to be interesting too, because Coach Pittman will be facing his former assistant, Ben Williams, who left 2 seasons ago, went to SFA, won their conference tournament, and is now at Houston. So it'll be a little interesting in that, the opponent, or at least the coach, is very familiar with UTSA, and we're familiar with Houston's coach and how he's going to play. So it'll be interesting to see how much of an advantage or a disadvantage that relationship might prove to be.
I'm glad you brought it up, because the chess match between those two is probably, I don't think it's going to be hyped up too much, but I would certainly like to see how they go up against each other. And, obviously it sounds like, especially with the Houston, a Big 12 team, that they'll have the the advantage maybe in terms of talent level, but we'll see because we've played them tough, over the last few seasons, and I think the talent level continues to increase. So hopefully we're closing the gap there.
Definitely. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this season unfolds. The preseason conference poll puts UTSA in 8th place, which is right where we finished last season. But because we were tied last season, we ended up missing the tournament. But I think it's probably good that we're in a position where we're not facing high expectations with the young team, because I think that'll give us likely the opportunity to surprise a couple of teams.
Yeah, and much like I said before the interview last week, and when we did our cold open, it was really the fact that I think this team can catch fire at the right time. But seeing what they do against, I think early on against Houston and TCU will give you a better idea of what it's going to look like, or at least what they're going to be able to build upon going into conference play. And there's still plenty of games. Obviously, there's going to be some, highs and lows. But you have to feel confident that this team is going to be in every single game.
Definitely. We also have Fan Fest going on at the Combo this Saturday from noon to 1 p.m. The soccer and volleyball teams will be available for autographs. 1 p.m. to 2:30, the football team will be available. It's free for fans, so certainly take an opportunity to come out and get to meet some of the UTSA student athletes. I think that about wraps it up for us. So thank you for joining us on the Hail Married podcast. I'm A. Toves.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back soon with some more preseason thoughts on football and some updates on soccer.
Birds up.